everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you, as I always do, from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the former Pleistocene playground, otherwise known as the Hollywood Hills. And on the other side of this digital divide, coming from the Pinyon Juniper Mesas south of Santa Fe, he's a native of Louisiana by way of Montana, and I consider him one of the greatest writers of American natural history. He is a professor of Western history. He is a spectacular environmental historian. If he looks familiar, it's because you saw him recently in American Buffalo, and I don't mean the David Mamet play. By that, I mean the wonderful new Ken Burns documentary, American Buffalo. He is the author of the best-selling Coyote America, and more recently, he wrote this terrific new book. I've read them both. It's called Wild New World, the epic story of animals and people in America. I read it. I recommend it. Welcome to A Rebel Without Applause, Dan Flores. Here's a picture of the book. Terrific read. It's at once big history, little history, and it's also personal to your life, which gives it an added dimension. So congratulations on just something that took me, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk about all this.
Well, it is, and it must be an incredible pleasure, I think, where it seems like your life passion, which to me seems about experiencing what's wild, and your intellectual and professional passions have this sort of almost perfect convergence. And I feel like that's a very fortunate thing in this world.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to have come along at a time in my education when something called environmental history had sort of emerged out of the blue. I mean, it clearly was one of those things that came about as a result of the 1960s and the ecology movement and Rachel Carson's great book, Silent Spring, and Aldo Leopold and all that, and the passage of the Endangered Species Act. So all of those things kind of set up a field of study that I started out my education as an English major, and when I went for a PhD, I discovered that there was this whole brand new field called environmental history, and so yeah, it was kind of a fortunate thing to happen along at the right time to be able to study what I wanted to.
Well, I remember reading about some of your influences, like the Walt Disney, the Wonderful World of Disney, and I guess there were red wolves or coyotes in your neighborhood, and just as a kid, I remember we going on trips, and I'm looking out the window of the car as we drove places, and I just desperately wanted to burst out of the car and go experience something that was wild. My imagination was very much cultivated by movies. As a matter of fact, my last podcast was all about Warner Brothers, which my grandfather worked at since 1927. And you mentioned in one of your, I think it was the Coyote book, the important influence of Wile E. Coyote as well on the cultural zeitgeist. So just to be close to what's left that's really wild has been something that I felt, and I feel it through you and your books.
Well, it's something that I strongly suspect is deep within our genetic memories, because that's what we come from as a species. I mean, we existed for 45,000 generations as hunters of animals. I mean, and that is an awfully long time in the human story. I mean, we've only been living in cities for 5,000 years, have only had the internet for 30 years. So
Yeah.
I mean, the whole world that we're in these days is some brand new thing.
Right. And of course, Jared Diamond wrote brilliantly about that in Gun, Germs, and Steel. This just clash between these agricultural societies that have domesticated animals and these basic hunting gathering remnant societies. And that's sort of, I think, the overview of what we saw in the 19th century, sadly, is just these clash of cultures, for better or worse. And I think there's something to learn from our hunting and gathering ancestors and friends. That
Well, I mean, there really is, and I think a lot of us are entranced by the idea of how indigenous people lived on the planet. And for a long time, of course, we've been interested in their environmental ethic. And one of the things that I was able to do, obviously, in both those books, in both Coyote America and especially in Wild New World, was to spend some time. I mean, in Wild New World, I have an entire chapter that I devote to the 10,000 year period before Europeans get to North America, with the question, of course, is how are Native people across that vast span of time able to preserve the biological diversity of the continent? Which, I mean, I could only find evidence of one extinction that had
right.
taken place across that 10,000 years in North America. And that was a flightless sea duck, which on the Pacific coast finally became extinct due to overhunting by about 2,500 years ago. But otherwise, people managed to preserve this remarkable diversity right down to 500 years ago when Old Worlders arrived. And it's something that we need to pay attention to. And I think that I mean, it has to do with the fact that they consciously kept their populations small, for one
Hmm.
thing. The agricultural revolution, which produced larger populations and life in towns and cities, didn't happen in the Americas until a lot later than it happened in the Old World. But I'm convinced that the primary thing that allowed people to do this was essentially the philosophy they had about the human kinship with other animals around them. And to me, what they managed to do, and I think this may go back really far into the past in the human story, is they understood through some kind of intuition about how the world worked that humans were not exceptional, that we were part of the same kind of great myriad of life that they saw all around them. And as a result of that, they managed to look at other creatures as being worthy of their respect, of their care. And that was quite a bit different than the ideology that Europeans in particular brought to the Americas when we arrived. We came with a whole different mindset.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. One of the things that was, you described early on in your book was, of course, the Clovisia the Beautiful. I would have loved to have been there and seen all of our Pleistocene friends, including, our smilodons and
Yeah.
short-faced bears, sloths, and possums. That these humans, through their technology, I guess, with whatever they had, these little fluted arrowheads, somehow managed within a span of a few thousand years to basically wipe out this bestiary, as you describe it, that was had survived many ice ages before to that moment. It was, I read about, like, well, it could have been the climate or the ice age. I go, wait a minute, these creatures had made it through various gauntlets of
Yeah.
ice ages before this arrival of these humans into North America. Now, it's hard for me to imagine, even though I'm in a basic agreement with you, how so few could have wiped out so many.
Well, it's so I will say that we've known about the Clovis people since the 1930s
Right.
because we discovered the first site, and the reason they're called Clovis is because it was near the town of Clovis, New Mexico,
Hmm.
and it was the first site that we found, and we've now got well over 100 of them in North America. Uh, but the first site indicated that these were people who, although they didn't necessarily hunt mammoths and mastodons exclusively, they were pretty skilled at being elephant hunters. And they also killed other creatures, large extinct forms of bison, uh, and quite a number of other things too. But the reason I call that chapter Clovisia the Beautiful is I'm trying to convey to the readers of this book who I sort of believe probably don't suspect that something like this is the case. But 13,000 years ago, what is now the United States, Canada, and Alaska had a culture that spread across the entire landmass from Pacific to Atlantic, from Alaska to Florida, and was in place as a consistent culture for longer than the United States has existed. This culture lasted for well over 300 years. Of course, the United States is only 270 years old at this
Hmm.
point. So we had a predecessor culture that spread from coast to coast and did something very much like we did. I mean, we don't know that they necessarily thought of themselves as occupying a nation state in the World Congress of Nations, but nonetheless, they were a people found everywhere across what is now the United States. And they were primarily big game hunters. I mean, they certainly gathered plants and made use of plant material, but they primarily focused on big game. The question, since we discovered them in the 1930s, and particularly after we got radiocarbon dating in the 1940s and 50s, so it's possible to date the site, is why do all the sites, or so many of them, of the extinctions of animals that had been here for, in some cases, 15, 17, 20 million years, suddenly all the radiocarbon dates for the last time mammoths appear, the last time mastodons appear, the last time a whole host of other creatures appear, all date to this 300-year period when the Clovis people are here. And what paleontologists have basically come to, and paleontologists and basically paleoecologists have come to argue as something of a kind of a coming together of minds here in the last 15 or 20 or so years, that we think it's the arrival of these really expert hunters in a place where animals had never seen people before, or if they had never seen people who were this professional at hunting them. And one of the things that happened, of course, the reason it could happen so quickly is that some of these animals, like the elephants, for instance, had, as elephants do, really long gestation periods. I mean, today, African elephants, the females aren't able to give birth until they're 7 or 8 or 9 years old. And then the gestation period is almost 2 years to give birth to a calf. And so what we think is that there were a number of species like that with really slow reproductive turnover. And the result of this arrival of these professional hunters who, as we were talking a few minutes ago before we went on here, also were using, they had dogs and they were also using fire. La Brea Tar Pits has recently done a study indicating that the fire these people were using was probably one of the really important developments in terms of their technology for pushing animals towards the brink. But one of the things I tend to think probably happened is that it wasn't so much that they just wiped everything out, but they very likely, and we have at least one really good example of this with mammoths,
Hmm.
they very likely pushed these populations into small, discrete groups that were isolated from one another so that over time, mammoths, for example, were no longer able to exchange genes between populations. And when genetic diversity begins to shrink like that, and our example of it are the animals of one of the islands in the Baltic Sea or in the
Right.
Bering Sea.
Bearing, yeah.
Yeah, down to 4,000 years ago, these mammoths survived, but they eventually went extinct because their genetic diversity was low enough that they reached a point where they couldn't reproduce. So the Wrangel Island mammoths kind of give us, I think, a little bit of a clue as to what might have happened on the mainland among some of those other species.
And of course, it wasn't just mammoths; it was horses and camels and sloths and I guess I'm trying to think.
Saber-toothed cats.
Saber-toothed cats. I'm not sure if they were, since, I don't know if they were hunted, but certainly they were hunters. And if they lost
Their prey. Yeah.
their prey, just like, T-Rex and Triceratops that were doing this dance for so many million years, this predator-prey relationship. Oddly enough, since humans see themselves as predators, I think, we immediately are in competition with fellow predators, whether
Yes.
it's wolves, sharks, jaws. We don't like those other predators. For we want to keep the deer and whatever they are to ourselves. I think that's maybe somewhere in the I don't know, in our minds.
Yeah, it's in the neurological wiring, I think, because I mean, we ultimately, part of our success is that we emerged about 2.5 million years ago from a scavenger lifestyle to a predatory lifestyle. I mean, today we tend to call it hunting. When humans do it, it's hunting. But when other animals do it, it's predation. But of
Right.
course, what we've been are predators. And as we migrated around the world, particularly looking for animals like those in North America that had no exposure to us before and therefore were easy to approach and kill. I mean, we had a really tremendous effect. I argue, as you know, in Wild New World, that what we today call the sixth extinction, which most people sort of think of as being a very contemporary thing, and I'm following the work of some of the leading paleontologists out there, we think actually that the sixth extinction has probably been going on for 30 or 40,000 years, ever since humans began migrating across the globe, and that it's been this slow motion kind of extinction scenario that has been primarily caused by humans.
Two things. You introduced an idea that I go, whoa, was I say it the Anthropocene, but you said it differently. How do you say? I say Anthropocene, but
Well, I think it can be pronounced either way. I think Anthropocene is correct. Anthropocene is another
okay,
pronunciation of
Anthropocene,
it.
Anthropocene.
Yeah, yeah.
You date it to really the arrival of the Clovis people, whereas I read, some people say, well, no, it's with the arrival of the atomic bomb and the plastics and all that. But I thought your case was very compelling because it showed sort of a larger link between contemporary humans and our ancient ancestors.
Well, I have argued in a variety of things in an op-ed I wrote recently, for example, that global climate change is not the first time that humans have completely remade the world. And one of the times that we have remade it is in this migration scenario that we were just talking about. Because, I mean, according to an National Academy of Sciences multi-authored piece in 2018, those authors argued that as we migrated out of Africa and around the world, we brought about the extinction of more than 300 mammal species with the loss of more than 2.5 billion years or 2.5 million years, of genetic diversity, of faunal genetic diversity on the planet. So, yeah, that's one of my arguments about the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene, however we want to say it, is that our usual argument is, okay, so this began with the use of fossil fuels, or it
Right.
began with the atomic bomb, or I argue that the era when humans have remade the world began 30 or 40,000 years ago when we were migrating around the planet and taking out all of these animals and diminishing the genetic diversity of Earth in such a dramatic way.
Now, one of the things it's in your book as well, but it really got me thinking was, so we have this catastrophe called the Pleistocene era extinction, where just this huge menu of animals are gone, and then, as you described it earlier, we have this period where there's kind of an equilibrium is sort of found, and I get the feeling that perhaps there was some learning curve amongst humans, or the descendants of these Clovis people, which I'm guessing were the contemporary American tribes that we kind of have identified today, they must have learned something because they found a sort of a coexistence, I think.
Well, I think they did. I certainly argue that. And I provide an example later in that chapter. That particular chapter in Wild New World is called Ravens and Coyotes America, because those were two of the primary deity figures of the period. We don't know, because these were not cultures that wrote their history. It was an oral tradition. We don't know the names of very many individual people. I mean, outside, like among the Mayans, who actually had a form of writing.
Hmm.
But most of the people in North America did not record in a way that we could find out now the names of their leaders or their philosophers, but they did leave us the accounts of their deities. And among their most prominent deities were Raven and Coyote. So, what I tried to do with that chapter was to gauge just what you introduced, whether or not they took a lesson from the loss of all these creatures during the Pleistocene. I mean, we lost 32 genera, not just species, but whole genuses of the biggest, most charismatic animals in North America during the Pleistocene. And, among them were, and people don't usually ever think of this, I try to make a point of it in Wild New World. North America was the evolutionary home of all the horses and burros of the world. And it was the evolutionary home of the camels.
Right.
And of course, all the canids, all the wolves and coyotes too, all those animals came out of North America. And one of the real mysteries of the Pleistocene, because we don't, so far at least, have very many archaeological sites where there's evidence that people were hunting and killing horses and camels. There's some, but not
Hmm.
a huge amount, except in Europe. But those animals migrated across the land bridges into Asia, Europe, Africa, survived in all those places, but became extinct in North America. And the crazy thing about the camel story is that, I mean, we had a camel, yesterday's camel, it's called, that looks almost like a modern day camel. You'd recognize it instantly. It became extinct about 9,000 years ago in North America, and yet the camels survive in South America. The alpacas, the llamas, they're all
Right.
still
Camel.
there, and we lose ours. So it's it's a mystery, and I think the people who occupy America in this next stage, they understand that something really traumatic has happened. And as I was about to say a minute ago, I provide an example towards the end of that chapter of a group of people, the people of the Chacoan Empire of the Southwest, that collapses about 1,000 years ago. And in the aftermath of that collapse, they clearly retrench in an ecological way. They reduce their numbers, they reduce their impact on the landscape. So we've got an example that native people react to a kind of an overreach by pulling back. And I think that's kind of what happened in North America for this 10,000 year period before Europeans and old worlders arrive, is that you have this kind of pulling back and what appear to be pretty conscious attempts to not stress the environment of the continent.
I think Jared Diamond writes about that in the book. I think it's Collapse.
Yeah, he does write about that in Collapse. And, it had been quite a while since I read Collapse, but I took another look at it when I was doing the research for Wild New World, and it no doubt colored some of my thinking about that. But I do believe that we have the ability to look at our overreach when we go too far and to pull back. And there are, I mean, people who read that particular chapter in Wild New World, I think, are going to find quite a number of examples of that kind of thing. It's kind of a very considered, on the part of people who lived here all over that long stretch, a very considered way of looking at the world around you to make sure that you don't push things too far. And the result of that is, I mean, they go for an astonishing 10,000 years with, as I said, only one extinction that I could actually find in that period.
And ultimately, it's kind of a hopeful message buried in there is that within our capacity for adaptation is a capacity of restoration and adjustment. And we see that, and you write about it also quite brilliantly, our own environmental movement and the emerging of that kind of awareness, whether it's Emerson, and I think also Darwin, to me, is
Crucial to the story.
1869.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an intellectual revolution that's on a scale with anything else to me.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I think On the Origin of Species is a top flight candidate for one of the greatest books ever written. And to me, what Darwin did, and he's a major part of my story in this book, clearly, he has to be. But one of the things he did was he managed to give a scientific legitimacy to these ideas that I think many ancient human societies had long held about our kinship with the other creatures around us. I mean, what Darwin was, the period that Darwin was writing, of course, was right in the middle of the European notions of humans are exceptional. We're made in the image of a God. We are the only ones that have souls. And so everything else is subordinate to us. But
right.
Darwin demonstrated with science that this older human idea, which was part of, I think, the success of 10,000 years of Native America, too, that actually it is completely scientific. We come out of the same evolutionary stream as everything else on the planet. And so, yeah, it's a tremendous intellectual breakthrough.
Yeah, and then at the same time, you've got Marsh and Cope digging, especially Marsh with the horses. He's finding it like, no, look, these are horses. What do you mean? And then that inflames a debate. At the same time as this extinction, this massive assault on just animals is going on, especially in the American West. It's a very rich period of history and time. I've been buried in it myself. So it's so interesting. I last was it okay a year ago. I went to South Dakota and I got invited on a dino dig. So right here is a Cretaceous era fragment, probably a rib. I can only guess what it isn't. It's not a vertebrae. It's not a skull. It's not a metacarpal. It's probably a rib from maybe, I don't know, but
Who knows? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert enough, but it's a dinosaur. It's this guy lived before that 67 million year, Chicxulub event. So
Yeah.
it's just mind blowing to me. And one of the things about your book is it is a catastrophic tragedy, of the loss of all these animals and the passenger pigeons, and I mean the ox. It was like this beauty that was right there, and there just seemed like something deep within the European psyche that wanted to just destroy and carve out something else that was safer. And what I wanted to just ask you, because this hit me when I read your book like a flash, was you referenced the Robin Hood story or the
Yeah.
Robin Hood mythology. What was that about? It was about Sherwood Forest. It was about this sequestered area that only the nobles were allowed to hunt. And that for the yeoman farmers and the peasantry, this was a massive injustice. And as you describe in your book, by medieval Europe, by the time there's contact with the Americas, most of what was wild in Europe was gone, pretty much, as you describe it. So, what I got to thinking was then when these European people arrive, and we talk about it all the time in our contemporary politics, is the meaning of freedom. But it seemed fundamental to these people's idea of freedom was the freedom to get in there with their guns and hunt and kill, as if there was this pent up demand from their European experience. And you infer and you get into that. But to me, that was just like boing, 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 because trying to understand our present moment with a fixation on guns and killing and violence and often where does this come from? And so that was just brilliant in your book. You can expand upon it, but I just wanted you to know that that hit me like a Clovis era point right in my skull.
Well, I mean, you explained it actually pretty well. I mean, that was it was a pent-up demand on the part of the classes that became colonists in North America and who had suffered through centuries of a feudal system that had denied ordinary people the right to go into the forests and hunt. All the remaining animals, and there wasn't much in Europe by the beginning of the American colonial period, but there were still deer, of course. But the deer were preserved for the pleasure, the deer and the wild boars for the pleasure of the elites.
Right.
And so you have this population of people who get to North America, and here everything seems to be completely free. And you probably remember from the book, but I come down with probably about four different time periods in the American story where I quote someone who says this in effect: nobody is going to be able to put laws and regulations on killing animals in America because it is part of our legacy, our birthright, our freedom, our franchise. One of the writers uses it. He says it's the American franchise. And the result of that ultimately was that in the early 20th century, when we started getting state wildlife laws and wardens, I mean, for about 10 or 15 years, one of the most dangerous occupations in North America was to be a game warden because tons of them ended up getting shot. They got
Right.
shot down by people who just said, you cannot stop me from doing this. And I think it goes back, much of that sentiment goes back to precisely what you described. It's the Robin Hood effect. And I mean, we think of Robin Hood in all kinds of other ways. He, steals from the rich and gives to the poor and all that. What he was a deer poacher. And he was a successful deer poacher in
Yeah,
Europe and became a romantic hero to
exactly.
so many of these people who come to America.
Yeah,
And, they get to America and nobody seems to, I mean, the native people say, well, the deer and the elk are actually ours. They're like our cattle. But nobody was willing to buy that. So it became this drumbeat in the background of the American Revolution, the Civil War, all the story that we think of as American history. Meanwhile, in the background, people are slaughtering animals at a rate that is just kind of unbelievable. I mean, white-tailed deer, as prolific as they are, the rule of thumb was you put down a town somewhere in Virginia or the Carolinas or Pennsylvania, and within 5 years, there will be no white-tailed deer within a day or two's travel. They'll all be gone because people will have killed them out. And this just repeats over and over, different places, different animals, all the way till the time we get to the West Coast and Alaska.
and to this moment, because I feel like so many, I mean, I was in Wyoming, as I mentioned, on a dino dig and a fly fishing adventure. I remember stopping in bars and people telling me, well, I got my elk tag and don't you, and this, where are you from? I'm from LA. Well, don't you tell me, like, well, no, you go get your elk. I don't care. Just don't point the gun at me. I'm fine. But so fundamental and deep to their idea of freedom was
Yeah.
their right with their gun to go into the forest and kill, get their animal. Now, admittedly, they eat it. I was not going to be standing there to protect it. I think there are other issues that are worse, like lack of habitat and stuff like that. But it just seemed like it was something deep inside of them, inside of this identity for freedom.
Yes, it's very much considered to be a core element of freedom in America throughout all the colonial period, the early republic, really well into the early 20th century. But as you know from having read Wild in the World, there's another component to it, which is making money off nature.
Right.
Because for millions and generations of Americans who don't have access, say, to living in cities or towns where you can work for money. If you're living in rural America for much of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, one way to produce money and to experience the whole American dream is you kill animals and sell them. This is, of course, called the market hunt in America, and it's part of what capitalism bequeaths us, along with this Judeo-Christian tradition that we're exceptional and everything else is put here for us to use. And
Hmm.
so the march across America, wiping out beavers, wiping out sea otters, wiping out buffalo. And when buffalo are gone, I mean, we're not done. I mean, we turn the guns on elk and on pronghorn antelope and on bighorn sheep. And how in the hell we were able to wipe out the two animals that were the most iconic to North America, the buffalo and the passenger pigeon, the two most numerous ones whose evolution had basically produced the kind of numbers that they had as a way to satiate predation so that predators could never wipe them out. And yet, all we have to do is have the Judeo Christian ethic of humans are exceptional and the economic idea of capitalism, and passenger pigeons that have been here for 15 million years can't last 300 years. I
Yeah.
mean, they don't last 300 years under the impress of that kind of thinking. And buffalo in a single century go from 30 million to fewer than 1,000.
I know.
I mean, it's, as I said, and I said this in the Ken Burns film, I um, kind of noted with interest that when the New York Times reviewed the Ken Burns film on the American buffalo, the one quote they used was one of mine, and it's one I use in Wild New World, and they also featured it in Ken Burns's film, and it's simply this: nowhere else in modern history has any people destroyed wildlife with such wild and reckless abandon and success as Americans did it in the years from the 1600s to the early 1900s. I mean, there's no other example in world history of this kind of destruction of animal life.
Do
But
you,
man, we pulled it off.
you know, do you think that the American Civil War, which was so catastrophic for just about everybody, so desensitized and just drenched the mentality of our society in violence and attachment to guns and weaponry, that it was like an accelerant for the decades that happened afterwards, especially on, the Great Plains, with the buffalo and the others?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be sure. I mean, life was cheap. Obviously, life during the Civil War, especially those last couple of years, 1864 and the
Oh,
three
yeah.
months of 65. I mean, they were doing frontal assaults against people armed with rifles that could kill you 800 and 1,000 yards away. I mean, the frontal assault might have worked 300 years before. But by the time you had weapons like that, the frontal assault was absolute suicide. And after the war was over, I mean, what you had on from both the North and the South was a population of young men who were really good with guns. They really knew how to use weaponry, and many of them had experienced this kind of wholesale slaughter in the Civil War. And some of the people who participated in this slaughter in the years from of wild animals from 1865 to into the 1920s, some of them uh, came to a kind of a moral crisis about it.
Mhm.
but a lot of them seem pretty blasé. I quote in Wild New World one of the buffalo hunters, a guy named Frank Mayer, who, I mean, Frank Mayer is a good example of these guys because they could make more money going out and killing buffalo than you could make back east working at a regular job. Of course, it didn't last long. I mean, it only lasted for maybe about 2 years, but you could nonetheless make an awful lot of money doing it. But Frank Mayer's comment at the end of the game, when all the buffalo were gone, was he said, I think that some people say we did this on behalf of civilization, on behalf of making America more like Europe or like England or something. But I think we did it because we didn't give a crap about the buffalo or about the future or anybody else. We just wanted to get ours, and that's what we did. So it almost came down to, the human prime directive of self-interest, which is what the United States, of course, is built on. The whole idea of, unleashing self-interest in order to make a country work and make an economy work. But when you unleash self-interest on populations of animals that there's no regulatory agency from government telling you you can't do this. You can't just slaughter them down to the point where there are none left. I mean, the end result was we just pushed one species after another to outright extinction or to the brink of extinction.
One of the more hopeful moments in your book is, of course, as you start to chronicle this emerging awareness about limits, whether it's Audubon or Grinnell, the Murray brothers, Teddy Roosevelt, all for different reasons, but they kind of are coming to grips with the limitations of the natural world and like, wait, so we got to preserve. And that gains momentum in our lifetimes, really.
Yeah.
And as you say, so, ironically in your book, one of the least likely American presidents who probably didn't know buffalo from a giraffe, by that I mean Richard Nixon, signs into law the Environmental Protection Agency and the Endangered Species Act. Today, he would be run out of the Republican Party and probably poisoned like a coyote somewhere,
Yeah.
for that. It's kind of ironic, but then there's some hopeful things there. And I want to say this before I say goodbye to our audience, is that one of the organizations that you mentioned in the book, and I made a donation, and I want to go and see what they've created there. I guess it's in southern
Montana.
eastern Montana. Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
American Prairie you're
The
talking about.
American Prairie.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's like, let's rewild this place.
Yeah.
And there's, it gives you hope. You see the videos, look, they're there, there is a hope, at least some portion of this. And you can expand upon that. I mean, I think you're involved with them because you mentioned it in your book. And
Yes, I am indeed involved with American Prairie and have been for a number of years. So I think, I know we're running out of time, and I'll try to summarize, but I think following Darwin, the thing that begins to turn the story around is the emergence of the science of ecology, because it's the ecologists in 20th century America who start bringing us into a kind of into grip with reality, with how the world works. That wolves had been here for 5 million years, shaping ecologies in North America, and we have to start thinking in terms of not just ourselves all the time, but about the other creatures around us. As Aldo Leopold, probably the most famous ecologist of the 20th century, put it, we have to come to grips with the fact that other species have a simple right, the right to exist. And that produces, as you said, Bill, in our time, when I was in college and in graduate school, the great ecology and environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s that results in, I mean, and people who have heard us talk so far are going to think, wow, Wild New World in particular is something of a bummer of a book. Actually, it's a very optimistic book
Hopeful, yeah.
because you reach this point in the story, and we come up with a Hail Mary, which is the Endangered Species Act of 1973, passed, by the way, 50 years ago next month.
Okay. Okay.
December, yes, of 2023, it'll be 50 years since the, excuse me, the Endangered Species Act was passed. Passed by a vote of 490 to 12 in the two houses of Congress,
Wow.
signed by Richard Nixon. This was a time when saving the world was not political. It didn't devolve into one side wants to save the world and the other side thinks it's all a hoax. Everybody was in on passing the Endangered Species Act, and the Endangered Species Act saved more than almost 60 different species, has recovered in our own time. What we're getting to witness, of course, is the recovery of animals like grizzly bears and particularly gray wolves.
Mm-hmm.
It saved our national symbol, the bald eagle. It saved California condors. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on, to the point where today, while we're certainly confronting an extinction scenario because of climate change, the United States is actually in better shape than almost anywhere else in the world, largely as a consequence of this Hail Mary in the form of the Endangered Species Act.
And I can say, just from my own experience, first as a diver, because I'm a scuba diver and a surfer, I've seen creatures that were kind of gone. All of a sudden, wait a minute, what a giant sea bass. Those things are gone. No, he's staring at me right in the face.
Yeah.
So nature does have this sort of capacity to recover. And then alternatively, too, I love fly fishing. Now, I'm a catch and release guy, so I can exercise my hunting, gathering instincts and all that without the mortality at the end. And I respect that because that's why the fish are there. Because if every jerk could get in there with the Rapala, there'd be no fish. But I just wanted to backtrack to the beaver because I've seen some of these streams that I've fished for many years. All of a sudden, I see little families of beaver, and all of a sudden, oh, look at that aspen's all chewed up, and there's a little break in the stream and a pool that really wasn't there 5 years ago. And guess what? It's filled with fish in a way
Yes.
that it wasn't before, when it was more like a straight stream, before it had been kind of engineered by these beaver that were either reintroduced or found their way back to these little streams. And so there's a hopeful message that things, a little nudge, a little protection, things actually can get better.
You get better. And the truth is, I think we're like about maybe 2/3 of the way through this story, and that the future holds many more restorations like this. So that, and you remember from Wild New World, I titled one of my chapters "To Know an Entire Heaven and an Entire Earth." That's a line from a journal entry by Henry David Thoreau in 1857, when
Right.
he sits down and he's reading the journals of his forebears who had been in the same piece of ground 200 years before, and realizes he's not getting to see anything like what they saw. And he says he wants to know an entire heaven and an entire earth. He doesn't want to think that some demigod had come before him and destroyed all the grandest things in the world so that he ends up not getting to experience it. I think we're in the process of a story that is still pointing us forward, and that we haven't gotten to the finish line by any means, but we're going to have opportunities to experience a more complete world and heaven than we've had a chance to in our present lifetimes.
And Dan, you are at the absolute point of that Clovis spear in making that heaven and earth, a tangible thing. And especially the more recent environmental history with the EPA and endangered ESA, all of that is hopeful. And it's sort of seeing that movement through maybe a similar lens that we celebrate some of the civil rights movement that was almost contemporaneous, maybe back into the 50s with Brown v. Board. But you feel like maybe there's a little cross pollination there where some, these rights could extend some to the
Oh, yeah, absolutely. To native people, I mean, this was the same period that produced the women's movement, the modern women's movement, a rebirth of civil rights after civil rights got destroyed following the Civil
reconstruction.
War.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Reconstruction. And so, indeed, so I mean, it all, and I think people who tended to be drawn to the age of ecology were also drawn to many of these same movements. They became supporters of civil rights, supporters of the women's movement. It's one of the, I mean, to me, the 60s and the 70s was one of the great periods in American history when we were once again trying to fully realize the American dream.
And even at this moment, some of the idealism of those decades, we're trying to hold on to and trying to build upon that. And you're of that moment. I guess I am too. More 70s than 60s, but still, I want to just first, anybody who watches this, go read the books. Coyote America, and especially now Wild New World. They're eye-opening. It takes you through a tragic gauntlet, but at the end of it, there's some hope. You kind of take us from the Pleistocene era to CRISPR,
Yeah.
So, it's just fantastic. So I want to just one, thank you for this time. I feel like I got a graduate seminar for tuition I didn't pay for, so it's fantastic. And your work deserves, just congratulations, and I appreciate you. And hang in there on the other side. I can say goodbye privately, but folks, I want to say read the book. Until next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha. See ya.